If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The storm came fast from the south, rolling over the Arizona basin like a wall of dust and rain. By the time Eli Turner noticed the dark clouds building on the horizon, it was already too late to prepare. He stepped out from the dim light of his cabin, pulling his coat tight around his shoulders, and scanned the fence line where his two horses stood restless in the wind. The air smelled of wet earth and lightning. Every sound was sharp: the creak of the gate, the nervous stamping of hooves, the low rumble of thunder behind the ridge. Eli moved quickly, but without panic. He'd lived alone long enough to know when to act and when to wait. He checked the barn doors, tightened the rope on the water barrels, and made sure his rifle was dry before setting it against the wall inside. When the first flash of lightning lit up the yard, he saw something move near the fence. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then he saw a shape, a person, slumped and barely moving. He hesitated for a moment. Out here, strangers meant trouble. The war with the tribes wasn't far behind him, and he knew that trust was a rare thing in these lands. But something in the stillness of that figure pulled him forward. Without overthinking, he grabbed his lantern and ran toward it. The woman lay face down in the mud, soaked through, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath her. Her breathing was shallow. Her ankle was swollen, and her clothes torn from brush and stone. Eli knelt beside her, brushing wet hair away from her face. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with high cheekbones and dark skin marked by exhaustion. Even in that brief glance, he recognized she was Apache. For a second, he froze. Old instincts screamed caution. The army had drilled it into him. Don't get involved. Don't bring trouble home. But another voice, the one he'd spent years trying to silence, spoke louder. She's hurt, and no one's coming. He lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, how cold her skin felt through the wet fabric. She stirred once, whispering something he couldn't catch, and went still again. He carried her back to the cabin, his boots sinking in the mud. The storm hit harder now, sheets of rain cutting across the open land, thunder rattling the walls. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp leather. Eli laid her on the cot near the fire, pulled a dry blanket over her, and crouched down to check her pulse. It was weak, but steady. He removed her wet boots and started the kettle on the stove. The sound of the water boiling filled the silence. He worked quietly, movements practiced, but unsure. He'd treated wounded soldiers before, but this was different. This wasn't duty, it was choice. He tore strips from an old shirt to bind her ankle, then sat back in his chair and watched the flames flicker across her face. Eli was 38 years old, though his face looked older. The sun and guilt had carved deep lines into him. Once, he had been a cavalry scout, a man who rode ahead of soldiers and marked trails through Apache land. But after the winter raid at Black Mesa, where women and children were caught in the crossfire, he left without a word. He'd buried his uniform, changed his name, and tried to live quietly on this small patch of land no one else wanted. He thought he'd made peace with that life, until now. The woman shifted in her sleep, muttering something in her language. Eli looked at her closely. There was dirt on her face, scratches along her arms, but also a strange strength in the way her hands curled, as if still holding onto something she refused to lose. He wondered who she was running from. The army? Settlers? Her own people? Out here, there were too many ways to get lost. As the storm raged outside, Eli sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together, thinking. He didn't owe her anything. He could take her to the fort in the morning, tell them he found her wandering. They'd take her in. Maybe. But the thought made his stomach tighten. He knew what they did to captives. He'd seen it before. He poured a cup of hot water, let it cool, and placed it on the small table beside her. Then he leaned back, staring at the rain pounding against the window. His jaw tightened as he made his decision. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. She stays, he muttered under his breath. Hours later, near dawn, the storm began to fade. The wind softened, and a faint light crept through the cracks in the shutters. The woman stirred, opened her eyes, and looked at him. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Don't send me back." Eli met her gaze and didn't answer right away. He just nodded once, slow and certain. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't cruel. It was the sound of two people who had already lost too much, deciding, without words, that for now, neither would face the morning alone. The morning after the storm was gray and still, the air heavy with the smell of wet dust and smoke. The rain had washed away most of the tracks outside, but not the sense of unease that lingered in Eli Turner's chest. He sat by the window, boots off, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The woman on the cot hadn't moved since dawn. Her breathing was steady now, her face pale but peaceful under the worn wool blanket. Eli wasn't sure what to do next. He wasn't a man used to guests, let alone someone like her, an Apache woman, wounded, terrified, and with no name she'd offered him yet. The army would have called her an enemy, but sitting there in the flickering light of the fire, she didn't look like anyone's enemy. Just another person caught in something too big to fight. He had 100 questions he didn't ask. Where she came from, how far she'd run, whether someone was looking for her. But the biggest one stayed quiet in his head. What would happen to her now? He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. By noon, she stirred. The first thing she did was look for her boots. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and cautious. "Where are my things?" Eli nodded toward the corner, drying by the fire. "Your ankle's bad. You won't be walking for a while." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching him the way a stray animal watches a hand that might hit or feed. Her eyes darted toward the door. "You can leave when you can walk," Eli said quietly, before she could ask. "You're safe here until then." The words hung in the air like smoke, simple, but not entirely convincing to either of them. Eli went back to his workbench and began cleaning his rifle. He didn't want her to see that her presence unsettled him, not in fear, but in uncertainty. He'd lived so long with silence that another heartbeat in the room felt almost foreign. Later, he made stew from the leftover beans and jerky. The cabin filled with the slow boil of the pot and the smell of salt and smoke. He served her a bowl and stepped back, letting her decide whether to eat. She studied it for a moment, then took a cautious bite. He watched her hands, thin, rough, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked hard and traveled far. After she finished, she spoke again. "You live alone?" Eli nodded once. "Been that way a while." "Why?" He hesitated, scraping the ash from his pipe. "Because it's easier that way." That answer seemed to satisfy her. She didn't ask again. When the evening came, Eli stepped outside to check the fence line. The sky had cleared, and the basin stretched wide and empty under a pale sunset. He felt the quiet pressing in again, the kind that reminded him of every reason he'd left the army. The faces, the orders, the smell of burning camps, all buried but never gone. He leaned on the fence post, thinking. He knew what people would say if they saw her here. A white man sheltering an Apache woman. It wouldn't matter that she was hurt or that she hadn't asked for anything. In these parts, that kind of mercy could get a man killed. Inside, Naomi, though he didn't know her name yet, lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had seen kindness before, but it always came with a cost. She couldn't decide if this man was naive or hiding something. The way he moved, calm, deliberate, didn't fit the kind of men who took advantage. But experience had taught her that safety never lasted. When Eli came back in, she spoke again, quieter this time. "You don't ask me who I am." He sat by the fire, shaking the rain from his coat. "You'll tell me if you want to." She looked into the flames for a long while, then said softly, "They were moving us north. Soldiers." I ran. Eli didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the fire. He didn't need more details. He already understood. He'd seen what those camps looked like. That night, after she fell asleep, Eli stayed up. He pulled an old photograph from the drawer, a younger version of himself in uniform, standing beside two men who were no longer alive. He studied it until the fire died down. He didn't know why he was helping her. Not really. Maybe because he owed it to the ones he couldn't save. Maybe because she reminded him that the world wasn't done testing him yet. When he finally lay down on the cot by the door, The sound of the wind brushing against the windows filled the room. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not peace exactly, but a sense that this silence, this strange shared space, might be the beginning of something that made sense again. And in that quiet, before sleep took him, Eli Turner realized he no longer felt entirely alone. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned. Morning light would slip through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting soft lines across the wooden floor. Eli rose first, as he always did, feeding the horses, checking the water barrels, and splitting wood before the sun cleared the ridge. Naomi would stay inside at first, quiet, wrapping her ankle and moving carefully around the small space. She spoke little, but the silence between them began to change. It wasn't the sharp kind anymore. It felt like something steady, a language neither had to translate. By the fifth day, she could walk short distances with a makeshift cane Eli carved from an old fence post. He had smoothed it carefully with a knife, sanding down the edges until her hand fit it perfectly. When he handed it to her, she looked at him for the first time without suspicion. "You made this?" He nodded. "It's not much, but it'll do." She tested it with her weight, then gave a faint nod. "Thank you." The word caught him off guard. Gratitude wasn't something he heard often anymore. That afternoon, while she rested on the porch, Eli worked on repairing the barn roof that had been torn loose by the storm. Naomi watched him from her chair, her eyes tracking his movements, the way he measured every step, the way he paused when the wind picked up, the faint limp in his right leg he tried to hide. She noticed the small scar above his knee, the kind that looked old but never stopped aching. She finally asked, "You were a soldier?" He froze mid-hammer strike, then answered without turning around. "A long time ago." She waited, expecting more, but he didn't offer it. The sound of nails meeting would fill the gap between them. When he came down from the ladder, she spoke again. "My people call men like you ghostwriters. Men who brought death and smoke." Eli set the hammer down. They weren't wrong. Her voice softened. "Then why are you here alone?" He looked at the horizon. "Because I couldn't live with the ones I rode with, or without what they did." That evening, they ate together for the first time, beans, corn, and dried meat boiled in one pot. Naomi sat across from him at the table, her ankles still wrapped but healing. She asked no more questions. There was a quiet understanding that some truths didn't need to be pulled out all at once. As the days stretched into weeks, Naomi began to help more. She swept the floors, mended the torn curtains, and even tended to the horses. Eli didn't stop her. He knew it gave her purpose. He watched how she calmed the nervous mare just by humming under her breath. There was patience in her and control, traits that came from surviving more than anyone should. Still, something lingered unsaid between them. Eli sometimes caught her glancing toward the ridge at dusk, as if expecting someone. He wondered if she had family still out there, or if she was running from more than the soldiers. He didn't ask, not yet. But when he saw her rubbing a small carved pendant she kept tied around her wrist, he understood it meant someone, or something, she couldn't let go of. One afternoon, while checking the traps near the creek, Eli heard distant hoofbeats. His hand went to his revolver by instinct. He crouched behind a fallen tree, watching a lone rider appear over the hill. The man stopped, scanning the land, then rode off toward the west. Eli stayed low, waiting until the sound faded completely before heading back. When he returned, Naomi was standing by the door, gripping the cane tight. She had seen it too. "They're looking for me," she said quietly. He nodded. "I figured." Her eyes met his. "You could tell them where I am. It would make your life easier." "I've had enough of easy," Eli replied. That night, they barely spoke. The fire burned low, the silence heavy again, not out of fear this time, but from the weight of what they both knew. Trouble was coming. When Naomi finally broke the silence, her voice was steady. "If they find me, they'll kill me. They think I led others away from the camp. I didn't, but they won't believe me." Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then they'll have to come through me first." She looked at him a long time, her expression unreadable. "Why would you risk that for me?" He hesitated before answering. "Because once, someone risked it for me, and I didn't deserve it either." The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the wind carried the faint howl of coyotes across the basin. Naomi lowered her head, tears threatening but never falling. She wasn't used to kindness without condition. Eli stood and moved toward the door. I'll keep watch tonight. You should rest. As he stepped outside, the night was cold but clear. He leaned against the railing, staring at the open land ahead, a place that had taken everything from him, yet somehow given him this small, fragile reason to stay awake. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he cared enough to find out. Inside, Naomi lay awake, the firelight flickering against the walls. She whispered something in her language, a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood, a plea for peace, not escape. And though neither said it aloud, both of them knew the truth. The moment they stopped running from their pasts, they had started building something new. It was uncertain, fragile, and silent, but it was real. The morning after the rider appeared, the basin felt different. The air carried tension, quiet but sharp, like the stillness before a hunt. Eli had slept little, if at all. He'd spent most of the night on the porch, watching the horizon, waiting for movement that never came. The first light of dawn revealed nothing but dust trails far in the distance. Still, he knew better than to believe the danger had passed. Inside, Naomi moved slower than usual. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her movements deliberate and cautious. When Eli stepped in, she looked up from the pot she was stirring. "They will come," she said flatly. It wasn't fear in her voice, it was certainty. Eli nodded, setting down his rifle on the table. "Then we'll be ready." He didn't know what ready really meant. He had no soldiers, no backup, no law on his side. Just an old rifle, a few rounds, and a woman whose courage seemed steadier than his own. But there was no point pretending. He'd already chosen his side. As the day went on, Eli began to prepare quietly. He reinforced the door with extra planks, checked the hinges on the shutters, and filled the water barrels. Naomi helped where she could, limping but determined. She gathered what little food they had left, her hands moving with the calm focus of someone who had lived through worse. While they worked, she spoke more than before. "I had a brother," she said suddenly, without looking at him. "You asked once, but I didn't answer." Eli paused his hammering. "What happened to him?" "He was with the others. The soldiers took him when I escaped. I don't know if he's alive." Eli didn't know what to say. He wanted to promise something: safety, reunion, hope, but he had learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. So he simply said, "If he's alive, we'll find him." Naomi gave a small nod, neither believing nor dismissing it. The conversation died there, but something changed between them. The wall of silence that had defined their days began to soften. She trusted him enough to let him see the parts of her she kept buried, the pain that never left. By evening, the wind shifted again, and Eli caught sight of dust rising near the old trail. He went inside, grabbed his rifle, and watched through the narrow gap of the shutter. 3 riders, moving slow, deliberate, scanning the land. He didn't recognize them, but the way they spread out told him everything he needed to know. They were searching. Naomi stood behind him, her face pale but steady. "That's them." Eli's hand tightened on a rifle. "You should go to the back. If something happens..." She cut him off. "I won't hide again." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. There was no time for argument, and both knew it. The riders approached the cabin, stopping about 30 yards out. The man in front wore a black duster and a U.S. Marshal badge that caught the sun when he turned. His face was narrow, his eyes sharp and assessing. He called out, "Eli Turner, I know who you are, and I know who you're sheltering. Step outside." Eli's pulse thudded in his chest. He opened the door, but didn't step beyond it. "You've got no right to be here," he said. The marshal smirked. "I've got every right. You're harboring a fugitive. Apache woman escaped custody last month near Fort Lowell. She's wanted alive." He paused, letting the word alive hang in the air like a false mercy. "I'm here to take her in." Eli's voice stayed calm, but his jaw was tight. "You ride back to town and tell them you found nothing here." The marshal tilted his head. "You protecting her, Turner? You forget what happened at Black Mesa? Or is this your way of atoning?" Eli's blood ran cold. The man knew his past. He stepped out then, slow and deliberate, the rifle hanging loosely in his hand. You don't know a damn thing about what happened there. The marshal's smile turned thin. I know you were part of it. I know you left your post. Deserted. Men like you don't get to hide forever. Naomi's voice came from behind Eli, calm and steady. He's not hiding. He's surviving. The marshal shifted his gaze toward her, and Eli saw something flicker in the man's eyes. Recognition, or maybe greed. Well, there she is. Makes my job easier. Before Eli could react, the marshal moved his hand toward his holster. The world seemed to slow, dust swirling, a hawk calling in the distance. Naomi's sharp intake of breath. Eli raised his rifle first, his voice cold and clear. Don't. The marshal hesitated, reading the look in Eli's eyes. It wasn't bluff. It was the look of a man with nothing left to lose. Finally, the marshal stepped back, keeping his tone even. This isn't over, Turner. The law always comes back around. He turned his horse, motioning for the others to follow. Within minutes, they disappeared down the trail, leaving only silence behind. When they were gone, Naomi exhaled, her shoulders sagging. They'll be back, she said softly. Eli nodded. I know. That night, the two of them sat by the fire again, the tension still hanging thick in the air. Naomi broke the silence first. You could have given me up. Why didn't you? Eli looked at her, the firelight catching the scars on his face. Because I've done enough giving people up to last a lifetime. She stared into the flames, her eyes glassy. If they come again, I won't let you die for me. He gave a faint, tired smile. You don't get to decide that. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. Inside, they sat close to the fire, the flickering light drawing faint warmth to their faces. The night was long, and neither slept much, but the silence that surrounded them now felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And though neither said it aloud, both knew that from this moment on, there was no turning back. The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. The sky was clear, the wind soft, but there was a heaviness in the air that both of them could feel. Eli repaired what he could. The fence, the gate, the cracks around the windows, but he knew none of it would stop what was coming. The marshal had left without a fight only because he wanted backup. And men like that didn't give up. Naomi moved through the cabin with a tense calm, cleaning, preparing, collecting what few things could be carried. Her ankle was almost healed now, but she still walked with a faint limp. Every time she glanced out the window, her jaw tightened. She didn't have to say what both of them knew. They were running out of time. That evening, as Eli sharpened his knife by the fire, she finally asked, You said you were at Black Mesa. What happened there? He stopped, staring at the blade in his hands. For a long while, he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, It was winter. We were ordered to clear out a camp. They said it was hostile. It wasn't. He looked up at her. I saw things no one should see. I followed orders I should have disobeyed. When it was over, I couldn't live with it. So I left. Naomi's face was unreadable, her eyes searching his. And now you help one of the people your army tried to destroy. I'm not trying to help a people, he said. I'm trying to help a person. You. She didn't answer, but her gaze softened. For the first time, she saw in him something beyond guilt, the need to make something right, no matter how small. That night, they heard horses again. This time there was no doubt. More than one, maybe 3 or 4, moving slow along the trail toward the cabin. Eli stood, his rifle in hand. Naomi moved to the back window, peering through the slats. How many? He asked. 4, she said. The same man leading. Eli's stomach tightened. Baylor, the marshal, had returned. He motioned toward the back door. There's a trail leading down to the creek. Take the horse and go. Naomi turned on him sharply. No, you'll be killed. He met her stare. If they get both of us, there's no one left to tell the truth. Her voice rose. You think I came this far to run again? Outside, the sound of hooves stopped. Voices called out, demanding surrender. Eli positioned himself near the window, checking the rifle chamber. Naomi stood beside him, gripping the shotgun he'd given her earlier. The first shot shattered the stillness, a warning blast that tore a hole through the doorframe. with splintered glass cracked. Eli ducked low, returning fire, hitting one of the men's hats clean off. The others spread out fast, firing from cover. Naomi crouched beside the window, eyes steady, hands trembling slightly as she cocked the shotgun. She waited until she saw movement, then fired. The sound was deafening inside the small cabin. When the smoke cleared, one of the riders was down. Baylor shouted from outside, his voice sharp and furious. "You're making it worse, Turner. Hand her over and you live." Eli shouted back, "You had your chance to walk away." A bullet tore through the wall inches for Naomi's shoulder. She flinched but didn't back down. Eli reloaded, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out the gunfire. He had been in battles before, but this felt different. This time, he was fighting for something worth dying for. The gunfire went on for minutes that felt like hours. Smoke filled the cabin, and the air stank of gunpowder and sweat. Then silence. Only the crackle of the dying fire and the faint groans of one of the wounded men outside. Eli stepped toward the door, rifle ready. Naomi caught his arm. "Don't." He shook his head. "It's over." He opened the door slowly. Baylor was there, standing 10 yards away, revolver in hand, his coat covered in dust. His eyes burned with rage. "You think this ends here?" he spat. Eli raised his rifle, but didn't shoot. "It ends with you leaving." Baylor smiled coldly. "Then you'll have to make me." Before Eli could react, Baylor fired. The bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him back. Naomi screamed his name and fired once, a single, sharp blast that echoed across the basin. Baylor staggered backward, fell to his knees, and collapsed. Eli slumped against the doorframe, clutching his wound. Blood soaked through his sleeve, but he was conscious. Naomi was beside him instantly, tearing fabric from her dress to stop the bleeding. "Stay still," she whispered, pressing her hands over the wound. He tried to smile, grimacing from the pain. "You said you wouldn't let me die for you." "I lied," she said softly. They stayed there until the sun began to rise, the orange light spilling across the land. When it was over, Eli buried Baylor and the others beyond the ridge. Naomi helped, silent but steady. Neither spoke during the burial. There was no need. Later, back inside the cabin, Naomi cleaned his wound, her hands gentle but firm. "You can't stay here," she said finally. "They'll send more men." Eli looked at her. "Where would we go?" She hesitated, then said, "North, to the mountains. My people had a camp there once. If it still stands, we can make it home." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll go." That night, as the wind moved softly through the open plains, they sat side by side on the porch. The air smelled of rain and pine. Eli's arm was bandaged. Naomi's eyes were tired but calm. For the first time in years, the quiet between them wasn't heavy. It felt alive. The past, both of theirs, had finally caught up and burned itself out. All that remained was the road ahead. And though they didn't say it, both knew that whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. They left at dawn 2 days later. The land behind them was quiet. No smoke, no riders, no more echoes of gunfire. The basin stretched wide and endless, the morning sun painting it in muted gold. Eli's arm was still bound in cloth, his movements slower, but he refused to rest. Naomi rode beside him, her posture upright, her eyes scanning the horizon like someone who knew the land better than the compass ever could. The horse carried their few belongings: food, water, a rifle, and the old blanket that had once covered her on that first night. They didn't speak much on the journey, but the silence between them had changed again. It wasn't made of fear or distance anymore. It was full of unspoken understanding, the kind that came only after both had seen what the other would bleed for. By midday, they reached higher ground. The air grew cooler, the terrain rougher. Naomi guided them along a narrow path carved between rocks and juniper trees. She hadn't been here in years, yet her memory guided her without hesitation. "My people used to trade along this ridge," she said quietly. "We camped near the river bend before the soldiers came." Eli looked around. The wildflowers, the broken fire rings half buried in the dirt, the faint outlines of old wagon tracks. "Feels like ghosts still walk here," he said, then caught himself. "I didn't mean." Naomi shook her head. "You're right. But not all ghosts are bad ones. They made camp near the river that evening. The water ran clear, cold, and alive with light. Eli knelt by the stream, washing the dirt from his hands, his reflection rippling in the current. His shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it. Naomi built the fire, her movements efficient and practiced. When she sat beside him, she handed him a tin cup filled with warm coffee. He studied her for a moment. "You've been quiet," he said. She nodded. "I was thinking about my brother. You still believe he might be alive?" She looked into the fire. "If he isn't, then I'll still live like he could be. That's how we survive, by pretending hope is enough." Eli said nothing. He understood. He'd been doing the same thing for years, pretending that a quiet life could wash away what he'd done. But now, sitting beside her, he realized he'd finally stopped pretending. The next morning, they continued north. The hills grew steeper, and by the third day, they reached a clearing where the remains of old shelters stood, wood frames, stone fire pits, and a circle of blackened earth. Naomi dismounted slowly, her eyes scanning the place. "This was it," she whispered. Eli stayed behind her, giving her space. She walked through the ruins, touching the wood, tracing her fingers along the charred edges. There was sadness in her movements, but not despair. She turned to him after a while. "We can rebuild here." Eli looked at the mountains, at the clear stream running nearby, at the wide stretch of sky that finally felt like it belonged to no one. He nodded. "Then let's start." They spent the next weeks gathering supplies, cutting timber, and repairing the old foundations. The work was hard but steady. Eli built the walls while Naomi shaped the clay for the hearth. They spoke little, yet every shared task drew them closer, not through words, but through effort, through the quiet rhythm of survival. Sometimes, at night, when the fire burned low, they'd talk about things that hadn't been spoken of before. Eli told her about the man he once rode with, how he'd left without saying goodbye, how he carried their faces in his sleep. Naomi told him about her mother, about the song she used to hum while grinding corn, about how the soldiers took her away one winter morning. Neither story was complete, but both understood enough. As the days passed, the cabin began to take shape, smaller than the one Eli had left behind, but stronger. Naomi hung a carved wooden bird above the doorway, the same one she'd made during those long, tense days back at the ranch. "It's for protection," she said simply. One evening, after weeks of work, the sky turned red as the sun dipped behind the mountains. They sat outside on a log, the cabin behind them glowing faintly from the fire inside. The air smelled of pine and smoke. Naomi broke the silence first. "Do you ever wish you could start over completely?" Eli thought for a moment. "Starting over means forgetting everything before it. I wouldn't trade what brought me here. Not anymore." She turned to him, her expression soft. "Even with what it cost you?" He nodded. Even then, they sat quietly after that. The world felt still, the sounds of the river and wind weaving through the silence like old companions. Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand brushing his. He didn't move away. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "So what now?" Eli smiled faintly. "Now we stay." The stars came out one by one, scattered across the darkening sky. In that quiet mountain clearing, surrounded by the remains of what had been and the promise of what could be, they found something neither had ever really known. Peace without guilt, love without fear, and the kind of home built not from walls, but from the decision to remain. Eli closed his eyes, the sound of the wind soft against the trees, and for the first time since leaving the army, he felt unburdened. Beside him, Naomi breathed evenly, calm and safe. The firelight flickered across their faces, and the night carried no threat, no echoes of pursuit, only the steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally stopped running. And when morning came, they were still there, together, alive, and no longer haunted by who they had been, but grounded in who they had become. The land, vast and silent, seemed to accept them at last. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs. And in the unforgiving world of the frontier, that was more than enough.